Bonsoir. I want to share with you a subject that I'm very passionate about. It's a complicated subject, but I'm going to try to condense it down and try to give it to you in the most informative way possible without making this video too long. My first try was over an hour. I'm not going to do that. So I want to talk to you about what complex PTSD is and how it differs from normal PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Bessel van der Kolk, in his book The Body Keeps the Score, wrote about how PTSD is much more likely to occur when survivors of trauma experienced helplessness and a lack of personal agency in what was happening to them, when nothing that they could do lessened the painful experience of the trauma. And trauma in this case, things like rape, assault, life-threatening situations, profound grief, combat situations, being in natural disasters and accidents and things of that nature, and being abused as well. Judith Herman, in her seminal work Trauma and Recovery, which many other books that I've read refer back to as kind of like this really awesome, and it still is awesome, book on trauma and recovery. In her book, she proposes a need for a separate diagnosis for complex PTSD, because when the trauma is prolonged over a long period of time, it profoundly affects the person on a much deeper and more intense level. And so the symptoms of complex PTSD are much more complicated. They're much bigger. She said one of the doctors she talked to about this told her that it was sort of like the syphilis of psychology, in that its symptoms mimic so many other things, including all of the personality disorders can be things that came out of complex PTSD, especially when the trauma was child abuse, because that happens while the personality is developing. But even for adults who undergo periods of captivity, they have personality changes when it goes on from months to years. So I'm going to read you the diagnostic criteria she proposed for inclusion into the DSM-4. It didn't make it in, and it isn't in the 5 as well, and I'm going to come back to that later. Her proposal for diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD were a history of subjection to totalitarian control over a long time, months to years. This includes hostages, prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, survivors of some religious cults, and those subjected to totalitarian systems in sexual and domestic life, survivors of domestic beating and battering, childhood physical or sexual abuse, and sexual exploitation or slavery. She noted that all of the other symptoms are about the alterations that it causes. Alterations in regulating emotions and coping with pain, including persistent depression and suicidal preoccupation, self-injury, explosive or extremely inhibited anger, and that it may alternate between those two things in an individual presenting symptoms, and also compulsive or extremely inhibited sexuality, and that this also may alternate. Alterations in consciousness, including amnesia or unusually enhanced memory around the traumatic events. Dissociation, which means kind of being checked out, being really out of it, but much more intensely than when one is, say, reading or driving or daydreaming. Feeling that one isn't real or losing touch with a sense of one's identity or self. Reliving experiences, either in the form of intrusive flashbacks or preoccupation. Alterations in self-perception, including shame, guilt, and self-blame. Sense of being defiled or stigmatized. Sense of complete difference from others. It may include a sense of specialness, utter aloneness, a belief that no other person can understand, or even a non-human identity. Alterations in systems of meaning, like loss of faith, sense of hopelessness and despair. Alterations in relations with other people, including isolation and withdrawal, which may alternate with a repeated search for rescuer. not trusting anyone, repeated failures of self-protection, alterations in perception of the perpetrator, and this is a big one I'm going to expand on a little bit. Alterations in perception of perpetrator, including preoccupation with relationship with the perpetrator, preoccupation with revenge, idealization, or even gratitude, a sense of special or supernatural relationship, acceptance of belief system, or the rationalization of the perpetrator. And this would include things like trauma bonding or betrayal bonding, or what we call Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a term that was coined in reference to the symptoms, the experiences that were had by people who had been held hostage in a bank vault during a bank robbery in Sweden for 6 days, where they became attached to their captors, they resisted efforts to help them, and then afterward even defended their captors. And this was in the 80s. Another really great book about this that I absolutely adore, that goes into enormous detail about this, is Pete Walker's Complex PTSD. And he proposes other symptoms that he has experienced and witnessed. He describes emotional flashbacks, which are an overwhelming feeling state without a specific memory, when there are too many memories associated with that feeling state that has been repeatedly triggered again and again over a long period of time. So like extreme rage, fear, shame, alienation, grief, depression, and it can last anywhere from moments to weeks of overwhelm, going into what psychologists call regression. And also toxic shame, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety are also manifestations of complex PTSD symptoms. That it didn't make it into the DSM-4 or the 5, I want to come back to that. It didn't make it into the DSM-4 or the 5. The DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, is a large book that has all of these diagnoses and diagnostic criteria for disorders and other things. Diagnoses can be useful when they point the way toward treatment that will help, and when it helps health insurance companies to cover that treatment. But where diagnoses become limiting is where one overly identifies with the diagnoses and where they limit someone from actually getting the help that they need. And that is why people propose new diagnoses, because complex PTSD is more complicated than PTSD coming from a single traumatic incident, because it goes on for such a long period of time and has the capacity to change a person profoundly. And short-term treatments don't really scratch the surface because it didn't get that way overnight, and it's not going to unhappen overnight. It's extremely unlikely for short-term cures to undo a long-term abuse situation. Also, another thing that I have noticed in my complex PTSD and others who live with ongoing trauma, Bell Hooks in Rock My Soul, Black People and Self-Esteem writes about talking to a teenage girl who was growing up with profound repeated trauma, like in an atmosphere of trauma that she had never been able to get out of, and she was unable to imagine. She did not know how. She could not use her imagination. It's been my experience that over time, and with more and more trauma, and living with the ongoing trauma of homelessness, it disrupted and corrupted my imagination, as well as my capacity for humor and enjoyment, because these things failed to be useful coping mechanisms in the face of that ongoing, awful, inescapable situation. The DSM is a way of perceiving psychology. It outlines diagnoses as a way of perceiving problematic manifestations in human psychology. Things, behaviors, thoughts, emotions, things that we have in our experiences that are problematic but are not purely physical, although they can have physical components to them as well. But the DSM is not an exclusive model of reality, so the fact that this isn't in the DSM does not mean that it's not a real experience. the reason the DSM keeps getting updated and the reason it's happening more frequently now than ever before is because we're learning a lot faster than we ever have before, more in how to perceive psychology and perceive neurology, how the brain works. We have things like functional MRIs, which is a way of watching the brain's activity as it's working. You can see the different parts of the brain lighting up and working. I love that. And a growing understanding of neurochemicals and the science of emotions and neuroplasticity, and seeing how people's brains will actually forge new connections. 100 years ago, we had no PTSD or post-traumatic stress syndrome or anything like that. The closest thing that we had was shell shock, which was exclusively for people who had experienced the horrors of war. But that didn't mean that we didn't have PTSD back then. So what I want to stress here is the DSM keeps changing, not because human psychology is fundamentally changing, but because our perception of it is changing as we learn more and more quickly. What was standard psychological treatment 50, 60 years ago is now sometimes seen as barbaric as drilling a hole in the head to let the demons out. We're learning so much so fast, but we're still struggling to catch up because these are just ways of looking at things that humans have always experienced. I believe that the disorders that we have now are not necessarily new. Some of them may manifest more due to certain characteristics of how we are socialized and how our culture is structured and how we take in information. But I believe that a lot of these things, especially post-traumatic stress disorder, have always been with us, that we have always experienced these things, but we may not have been able to put them into words or to express them. So we're learning better and better. We're learning more and more about these things as we study them and the people who suffer, but it's an ongoing process. What we know today is not what we're going to know tomorrow. Complex PTSD happens most often with survivors of child abuse. It's most common because children tend to have the fewest options to escape abuse, and child abuse is it's so common, especially when you include in neglect, which neglect is a form of abuse. Many organizations that we like to think are there to help children, like Child Protective Services, cannot serve the sheer number of children who are abused, and can sometimes put them into even more traumatic foster homes or other situations. When complex PTSD comes from child abuse, that means that those things that are altered, systems of meaning, consciousness, self-perception, perceptions of and relationships with other people, they don't develop in healthy ways. When the abuse is going on throughout the formative years while the personality and these things are being formed, there's no healthy state that one can recover. So there's no recovery possible. Whole new ways of perceiving, of consciousness, have to replace the ones that are there, which means unlearning these things that, if you can imagine, like trying to unlearn the way that you perceive yourself, the way that you perceive other people and relate to other people, the way that you remember things, your consciousness, and the way that you regulate emotions and pain. If you can imagine trying to let go of all of the ways that you do that now and replace it with a different set of ways. That's really, really hard. And it's especially hard to do as an adult because we lack a lot of support and reliable sources for modeling healthy ways of perceiving and relating and regulating and remembering. That, again, does not happen overnight. Complex PTSD is complicated, and even more complicated when it stems from abuse that lasted throughout childhood, throughout while a personality was developing. So it didn't get this way overnight. There are no magic bullet cures, much as we like to believe in those things. Short-term treatments that may work for single incident PTSD are highly unlikely to work for complex PTSD because of how deep these alterations are, and how in situations where it's from child abuse, there is no healthy state to recover. A whole new consciousness has to be built. I'm going to link to the books that I've mentioned and also to a website about adverse childhood experiences, which is another way of looking at this. I think different ways of looking at the same phenomena enable us to see a lot more of the picture. So it's never going to be perfect because we're trying to use the intellect to imagine, to look at, to describe, to define things that are more than just intellectual, experiential, and experience varies so much. One of my favorite things in Pete Walker's Complex PTSD is when he writes that when the C-PTSD is so bad that a person can't even bear to be around another person or trust enough to form a therapeutic relationship with a counselor, with a psychologist, with a therapist, that things that can help are animals, books, and online resources. And this confirms for me something that I had always known, that I had always turned to dogs. I had always turned to books, and I had already been doing that. That was how I found this. And with online resources, they're so much more safe, and there's a lot more inherent space and consent between me and other people. Because if somebody is doing or saying something that I don't like, and they're right there, physically there, and I ask them to stop, there's a strong possibility that they're not going to, or that an argument will ensue. Whereas if somebody is doing or saying something to me on the internet that I don't like, or someone writes something in a book that I don't agree with or I'm not comfortable reading anymore, I can close the book, I can close the computer, and they don't chase after me yelling at me. They don't have the capacity to threaten me or intimidate me or throw a tantrum or argue with me. You know, a book is not going to come after me and make me read it, but people have come after me and kept yelling at me so many times. People are problematic. Face-to-face is problematic for me. It is hard to set boundaries with some people. And these are the kind of people who are drawn to me because I don't have great boundaries. But things about like books and the internet, it helps because in writing things, there's at least the chance that somebody is going to take the time to actually read what I say and think about it and think before they write and at least review it. Many people do, some people don't, but at the very least, I have what they said later, so they can't deny what they said later. Writing is really empowering for me because it enables me to, like this, as I'm sharing this with you, I am consenting to share this with you. I have thought this through, I have edited this, and I have presented this to you. And you who are watching are consenting by watching this. You don't have to watch. If you're not comfortable, then you can close and click away. I'm sure you already do that. So this is a lot more consensual than a surprise conversation with me where I want to share something with you and maybe you don't want to hear this. But for you to get up and walk away would be artful. Whereas for you to click away, I'm not going to know unless I go and look in the Google Analytics. And I don't have to know how many people click away. And I don't have to care either. Because it's not a one-on-one thing. This isn't a real-time thing. So I'm not threatened if you go away. In fact, I'm glad. Thanks for taking care of yourself. Then I don't have to. Because that's the thing. When somebody is uncomfortable face-to-face, I often wind up taking care of their emotions. And that's not cool. I've noticed that we tend to have more empathy and compassion for abused shelter dogs who present symptoms. We're more understanding that because they've been abused, they may constantly be triggered by, like, say, a red shirt, or they may not want to be touched very much or in certain places. But we seem to have expectations that humans will just get over it, bounce back, and turn right back into whatever happy-go-lucky person we were before the abuse. Or just, somehow just get over it. So these expectations of humans to just completely get over it, I think are really toxic and make things harder and isolate and alienate people who are suffering even more. And that's just not cool. I mean, this is somebody who has gone through this intense, long period of abuse, and now they can't even get support from other people because we have a cultural denial and fear and shame surrounding the rampancy of domestic abuse and child abuse and neglect. I think that we have a real problem with the idea of humans in captivity in our own backyards, and the fact that this hits regardless of class or nationality or race or religion or any other division is really scary, because that means everyone is vulnerable, and it also means that everyone has the potential to be an abuser. And abusers don't go around wearing the word abuser on their foreheads. Abusers do not believe that they are abusing. I want to leave you with Judith Herman's radical notion near the end of the chapter on complex PTSD. We can learn from survivors who understand more profoundly than any investigators the effects of captivity. We can learn more from survivors who understand better than any investigators the effects of captivity. We can learn from them. This is not someone that we have to go and completely change. I have many things to say. The fact that I'm the survivor of so much abuse and so much trauma does not make me less of a person. Does not mean that my experiences and what I've learned from them don't have validity and value to other people. It means that there are a lot of things that are different from me. It means there are a lot of things I'll never have. I'll never not have had the childhood that I had. But there is no way for me to rewrite the past, nor should I aim to. Because for me to try to be someone who doesn't have this past would be me trying to not be me, to not start from where I am. And the best that I could do would be to become a pale, poor copy of someone who was not abused in their childhood, and it would be inauthentic because I don't really understand that experience any more than you could become someone who was abused in childhood if you weren't. Although I imagine many of you watching were, because it's very common. And I do hope that you have support and you have books, animals, and online resources at the very least. Other people, you might wish for me to get over it and to stop talking about it. But as I well know by now, not talking about it makes it worse. It creates an atmosphere of silence and shame, which is the atmosphere in which abuse blooms. We need to talk about these things. Thank you for watching and listening. Obviously, I have a lot more that I could say on this subject, but I hope this has been helpful for you, informative for you, and I'll include a lot of books and links in the description if you would like to learn more. Thank you for watching.